I guess that interest in the philosophy of economics, in the history of economic thought, comes from seeing so much of economics miss the point when when people try to take it to public policy. A lot of economists do a lot of highly technical work, a lot of excellent work in some ways, which just fails to connect because people don't buy the basic assumptions about human behaviour and the way the world works that economists make. So I'm very interested in where economics came from as a discipline, how those basic assumptions are formed, and how economists can engage with people in other disciplines. Now, Anne was saying how difficult it is sometimes in Crawford, even for economists and political scientists to engage with each other. Economists and anthropologists, economists and sociologists, economists and theologians would seem to be a particularly hard one. So certainly the historical work I've done has suggested that religion was very important in forming economics as a discipline in the 18th and 19th century. I've written a book on that for Routledge a couple of years ago, and there's another one coming out this year on a similar theme, looking more at, less specifically at Smith and more at the basic way of looking at the world that economics has and how that has religious roots, like most of the other sciences which formed in Britain over that period have religious roots. But anyway, that's, I guess, something of a background and justification for this topic today, which is applied economics applied to a public policy issue, but paying particular attention to the religious dimensions of the issue. I was first drawn into this in 1999 when Brian Howe, who was chair or president or something of the Council of Churches social, I can't even remember what the committee was called, Social Ethics Committee or Social Issues Committee or something like that, asked me to do some work on the then fairly brand new job network. And I said no twice because I wasn't a social policy person. My knowledge of the ins and outs of the welfare sector was pretty slim. And even most of the economics I did, which was international economics and labour economics, wasn't the economics the economics of incentives, which was most directly relevant to analysing job network contracts. But on the third attempt, Brian convinced me to do it because I would have something, he said, because I wouldn't be just one of those usual welfare bleeding hearts, or I wouldn't be one of these people that you knew what they were going to say even before they opened their mouth. So I did some work for Brian, which was fairly much for the churches, to help the churches think through some of the theological and the economic issues in taking on job network contracts. I did some theoretical work as well, which was published in mainstream economic journals, particularly a mathematical model of the job network incentive arrangements that was published in the Economic Record. That was a little while back. I've renewed my interest in this area, partly because the concerns that I had about the way the whole thing would evolve it seems sadly to have turned out that way. That a lot of the dreams that the people who put together the job network had just don't seem to have come to reality. And we're also facing a crucial period for the not-for-profit sector, where we've got a new regulatory body. We've got discussion of taxation arrangements for the not-for-profit sector, in particular what happens with fringe benefits tax, what happens with the definition of charity and its relationship to tax deductibility of donations. And also debate last year about anti-discrimination legislation and how it might affect. The application went in November last year. We'll find the result of the application in June. I'm not all that hopeful because the way the ASC works these days, it's very hard to get the large-scale interdisciplinary grants that I've put together. It's a consortium of 6, I think, linkage partners and 5 in the end universities, including the Crawford School at ANU is a partner in the project. So that's the background to today's presentation. I suspect most people in this room don't need convincing about the importance of contracting out of social services. I guess the people who need convincing are outside rather than in the room. Looking down the list, many of you I see are heavily involved in the sector, so this is not news to you, but contracting out of social services is now the dominant way that government services are delivered. Unusually, internationally, Australia's social services sector is dominated by religious organisations. You go to America, and I did a talk in Washington on Australia's experience with contracting out of social services. And the Americans think you're pulling their leg if you say that most job search services in Australia are delivered by organisations which have some sort of religious associations or religious foundations. And they just cannot get that one. And then you tell them that the government funds church schools, and they're sure that you're pulling your leg there. And then Catholic hospitals, and they think, well, come on, really? But Australia, by international standards, now has quite an unprecedented level of church involvement, either directly, we're not so different in congregational involvement, in direct congregational involvement in work of this type. But what's unusual is the large church-related organisations that are so important in social services. I'm not talking about education and health today, I'm talking about social services. It's very hard to get exact numbers. A number that's bandied about quite a bit is over 50%. For instance, Shirley Swain's survey in the JUP Encyclopedia of Religion in Australia quotes this figure of well over half of social services in Australia are delivered by church-related organisations. But given that most of the organisations themselves don't have any idea what proportion of even numbers of employees in some cases, because the organisations in Australia tend to be they tend to have a peak body in Canberra, state bases, and often lots and lots of organisations even within the one denomination. I know dealing with the Catholics in Victoria, it seemed like there were about 10 different organisations, and there's a Catholic Social Services Victoria as well as the Catholic Social Services Australia. There's a veritable, sort of huge network of organisations, none of which seem to have, or few of which seem to have much idea of how many staff they have, what their total value of the contracts they're doing for different governments. So I find it hard to believe some of these estimates, but I think well over 50% is pretty plausible and probably an understatement based on the work that I've done. Stephen Judd's book, which came out last year, and I'm happy, by the way, to distribute the overheads if anyone wants them, that have all these references in them. I don't know whether they can be, we can talk about it later, we can put them on the Crawford site, or I can put them on my website, whatever's easiest for people, so that you've got any of these references and the slides. But Stephen Judd's book goes through Australia's largest charities and social service organisations, and there are very, very few that don't have at least historical religious foundations. So the sector is big. Contracting out in Australia is big. It's unusually internationally dominated by religious organisations. But the other thing is the importance of social services for church life. I think the most extreme example of this in Australia is, or one of the most extreme, is the Salvation Army, where you've got a tiny church and a huge social services operation. The Uniting Church, it seems to me, is going very rapidly in that direction. A demographer estimated that the last Uniting Church member will die in a nursing home sometime in about 12 years' time. That may be a bit of an exaggeration, but certainly the mainstream Protestant churches You've got growing and prosperous social services arms, and usually shrinking congregations. Now, there's different views about this. Someone who was senior, not necessarily in the organisation I just mentioned, welcomed this and said that, well, this is really what the church should be doing. The local congregation will go the way of the horse and buggy. It was designed for rural England. The way of the future is the Christian witness being through social service organisations. And there are people on the other side who lament this, who see that something fundamental to Christianity is lost if you don't have some sort of congregational-based community, some sort of congregational-based worship alongside the social services work. Now, what does this stuff look like? Well, I found this is a picture from the article I wrote in the Economic Record, where I went on to do some sort of mathematical analysis of all these contracting arrangements. But basically, you've got a government who is writing contracts as a principle with welfare organisations. The welfare organisations, in order to get their money from the government, need to involve the unemployed in some way. This is specifically about the job network. But for an economist thinking about the incentive structure of these arrangements, and I'll get back to this briefly later in the talk, it's complicated because the welfare organisation or the agency is the agency name actually comes from being an agent of the church. So the idea is that the welfare organisation is doing work on behalf of the church, so it's something distinct from the church. Now, it's an agent of the church. But the most powerful principal-agent relationship, which seems to be driving the structure of these organisations today, is this principal-agent relationship between the government and the welfare organisation, because that's where most of the money flows, along this line rather than along this line here. If anything, the flows along this dimension are negative. The flows along this dimension are probably not enough, in my view, but certainly large and positive. So we're looking at arrangements like this. Now, I could spend some time talking about the job network arrangements and some other examples of things that are done a bit differently in the social services sector, but my guess is that most people here are pretty familiar with that, and we've got limited time, so I'm going to skip over and talk about why we got in this position. Why was the government interested in the mid-90s in abolishing the CES and contracting out job search assistance services to not-for-profit organisations, overwhelmingly church organisations? Well, I think the answer is money, largely. Money and a bit of ideology and a bit of political convenience. That it's cheap for the government. It was very hard to get data in the early days of the job network, and a close colleague ended up in a big shouting match with some of the public servants about their reluctance to release data that was in any way useful to economists working on cost and efficiency in the job network. But the best estimates were that the job network cost something around half what the old way of delivering these services was. Why is that? Well, one of the things that the church agencies have that the government doesn't is they're not so subject to unions. The CES was highly unionised. Most church organisations, don't have that same sort of inflexibility. Church organisations have access to volunteers in a way that the government doesn't. No one used to volunteer to work for the old CES, to go down and help unemployed people sort through the job boards or whatever. But there's an enormous amount of volunteering goes on in the church social services sector. Declining, but still substantial. And that volunteering keeps costs down. The churches were also trusted far more than the government in this area by the unemployed. And there are all sorts of efficiencies that come with a greater level of trust. In an arrangement where you've got to have the unemployed on board in order to get your job and cooperating with you to get your job network payments, client trust reduces costs of the system. The next one, government monopsony power. Now, I'm not going to go through any sort of technical analysis of monopsony, but what we're talking about here is something that's a bit like monopoly. Monopoly is where you've got a single seller of a product. And with monopoly, the monopolist is able to restrict output, drive up the price and make additional profits over a competitive market. In social services, the government is a monopsony buyer. So in the same sort of way, the government can restrict its purchases of services and drive the price down below the level that would be set in a competitive market where you had many buyers and many sellers. You've got a situation where there are a reasonably large number of people willing to tender for social service delivery contracts and usually just one buyer. So that is a situation where one would predict that the price is driven down quite substantially below the price that would be set in a competitive market that is really necessary for the sustainability of that service provision. Risk transfer. Well, there's all sorts of risks that are transferred when you contract out services. In job network, obviously, there's the business cycle risk. It's a harder job finding someone a position during a deep recession than it is during a boom. And so all that risk associated with changing economic circumstances is absorbed outside the government sector and without the sort of compensation that would be expected if that risk was transferred in commercial markets. The government, of course, is also free riding on the infrastructure, the donations, buildings, all sorts of other things given by faithful church members over many years. Government is also free riding on innovation. One of the things that tends to happen when the government is contracting is organisations are trying out new ways of delivering services. And what tends to happen is the organisation absorbs the cost of the failed innovations and the government funds the successes. And so if 50% of the innovations are good and 50% are bad and the innovation's a random process, then the government's saving a lot of money by having someone else absorb the failures and just funding the successes. So it's cheaper. A question an economist would ask about the cheapness is that reduction in costs actually efficiency gains, or is it just transfers between the government and other parties? If you look down that list, the majority of those things, certainly the big ones, would seem to me to be not efficiency gains but transfers from parties. So I think the government is getting a very, very large free ride on people in the social services sector through intensification of work, volunteering, all sorts of other things. So certainly cheaper, but it's debatable whether it's substantially more efficient than the alternative system. As well as cost, there's also some political advantages in contracting out. When there's some stuff up, you can say, oh well, it's not us, it's the people down there in the Anglicare office that have caused all these problems, and we, the government, will make sure we fix it. So rather than it coming to the minister's desk and him having to answer the queries about this complete screw-up that's happened, the government can transfer responsibility for the problem to someone else. Reduced transparency. I found it really interesting reading an article that Miles McGowan of the not-for-profit centre up in Queensland has written about secrecy in these contracts. Most of them are treated as commercial in confidence, And so it's very, very hard to have... It's a very different sort of capacity to get information about what's going on than if the government was delivering the services directly. Now, Miles has some points which I think are worth considering about changing those arrangements so that the contracts are subject to the normal sort of democratic review processes. But certainly the way things operate at the moment, there's a bit of a lack of transparency in social service contracting. And of course there's been accusations that the agencies have been co-opted, they've gone tame, they won't criticise the government because the government funds them. Now, of course, the government would strenuously deny that, and the agencies would strenuously deny that they would ever moderate their criticism of government policy because future contracts were at stake, but some people suspect it happens. Now, so that's why the government is interested. You need the government to play and you need the agencies to play. Why are the agencies interested? Well, the overwhelming answer that you get, and Anne has done a lot of this, Anne has done a lot more of this empirical work than I have now interviewing agencies. But it seems to me the answer is we are doing good work as an agency. Government funding allows us to do more of this good work, so we should take on the contracts. Or another one, particularly as some for-profit players have entered the market, some nasty for-profit players, that we as a caring church organisation do a better job than them. We care about quality, we care about people. So, we want to do this work because we do a good job. We feel we can care for people better than others. So we've had willing buyers and willing sellers in this market. But there's problems. Although many of the agencies have been growing and are financially sound, that's not the entire story. There's considerable evidence of erosion of quality. Now, I'm not going to go into that today, but there's an extended discussion of that in some of the papers that I've written. And that's not the erosion of quality is not because people in the sector are bad people or anything like that, but the arrangements are structured so that there are incentives to erode quality. In any system where you've got contracting and fixed price contracts of this type, and quality is not easily verifiable, so quality has to be verifiable. So we can have two of us observing a quality loss, but unless that quality, the level of quality is verifiable to a third party, then quality can't be written into contracts, and you'll have forces that are inevitably going to be eroding quality of service. There's strong evidence of reduced collaboration of some of those problems we've got there. But the one I most want to talk about, because I think there's been less discussion of this in the literature, is loss of the Christian identity of these organisations. The identity which means they're there in the first place, which has sustained these organisations doing the work that they've done over many years. There's debates, of course, about what mission identity mean in this social services context, vigorous debate. But I think there'd be few people who would, hold the line that there's been, the mission identity, as would be in some sort of consensus definition, has been eroded fairly substantially by the contracting arrangements over the last couple of decades. Now, there's questions, and this was largely what motivated me to get back into the area after a break of a few years, that I think there's real questions about the future of the sector. There's been a long time debates among economists about how effective programs like job search assistance are, but I'm not going to get into that today. James Heckman's work is, I think, the best work on this and not very encouraging. There's questions about the contracts and how they're structured. I find it remarkable how little involvement economists have had, either working for the social service agencies themselves or working for the government, in trying to get the incentive structure of these contracts right. There is some economic theory out there on how to do it well, to avoid quality erosion problems, to encourage teamwork and many of the other good things that you'd like to see in the sector. But unfortunately, the department is not terribly well endowed with people who have that sort of expertise, and the welfare organisations generally don't talk to economists. They're the sort of nasty individuals that are ruining the place. So economists don't play very well with social welfare people usually. So there's been, I think, sadly, far less involvement in getting the incentives right in the contracting arrangements. And also, I think the big question is about sustainability. What will the sector look like in 10 or 15 years? And I'm pretty pessimistic. My own view of this, and I hope I'm wrong, is that as the religious identity that has sustained these organisations declines, that volunteering will decline, that the sorts of leaders that have sustained quality and good service at a pretty cheap price for many years, as they retire and a new generation of leaders doesn't seem to be growing up to replace them, leaders who are both very good managers and have an understanding of the religious dimensions of this work, as they're not renewed, I think the outlook for the sector is not good. We could end up with a situation in a few years where these organisations look exactly like the old CES that no one laments. And that would be very, very sad, because the government would then have nowhere to turn. With these organisations having lost the capacity to sustain the things that made them attractive to the government in the first place, now where do we turn for delivering high quality social services in Australia? And that's perhaps may not be bad news for the organisations if the organisations, that scenario could happen with the organisations still being quite profitable, even growing. But it'll be very bad news for the people at the bottom who are served by these organisations. So again, I hope I'm wrong, but it's a large part of the motivation for spending time putting together that ASC linkage project that I'm just really pessimistic about the future of the sector. Not because of the individuals involved in it, there are many, many great people involved in the sector, but because of these structural factors. What do I think needs to be done to avoid this scenario? Well, this is speculations, opinions, whatever, but this is my take on it. I wrote something along these lines for the ABC, and for Scott Stevens' religion and ethics site last year, and I got called all sorts of things for some of these suggestions. But I think, see what you think. I think it's really important that the social service arms of churches think hard about who they are. So one of the components of our project is getting some ecclesiologists, so they're people who study what churches are, the theology of the church, if you like, to think about what these organisations are in relation to the church. Now, they're not really the church in the sense that we have traditionally understood the church as being a congregation or a group of congregations together. I guess I betray my own Protestant Anglican roots there. Now, each denomination looks at these issues, different religious traditions look at these issues differently. So you won't get the same answer for the understanding of what these organisations are in every religious tradition. But it's important, I think, for these organisations to be able to articulate who they are to their employees, to their volunteers, to potential donors, to the government. That they have a deeply rooted, theologically robust understanding of what they are in relation to the church and its mission. Now, I think that's one of the really big priorities. Now, it may sound a bit theoretical and waffly and academic for all of you people who are, some of you people who are closely involved in delivering services. As someone senior in one of these organisations said, if I'm going to sit around speculating on this sort of stuff, then there's 10 people who are homeless who I can't help. So I can kind of understand that sentiment, but I think having a robust and defensible understanding of what these organisations are in relation to the church and what their place in the mission of the church is absolutely crucial to their long-term survival. Now, point 2 follows from this a little bit. That one of the problems with leadership in these organisations is that if you're looking for someone to take on a senior position, you've got a couple of choices. You can jump one of two ways. You can pick some, cleric who's, maybe stuffed up things in a congregation, maybe has no organisational abilities, whatever, and has to be kind of shuffled sideways. And let's find him a job in the social service arm. He can't do too much harm. He's a nice person after all, and it's all about being nice to the poor in the end. So there's that sort of person. Obviously a caricature. So someone who maybe has a good understanding of, or has an understanding, it may actually, I think, often be a really terrible understanding if you've gone through a traditional theological education. You're often, I think, really theologically ill-equipped for running a social service organisation. But there's a theology, you have some theology anyway, but not much skills in running an organisation. And the other thing is to have the bloke who cruises in his sharp suit, jumps out of his BMW after, with sort of 3 bits of electronic gadgetry hanging off him, who's very good at all the technical and organisational aspects of running a large organisation, but has no clue and no sympathy about the culture of the organisation, no capacity to engage the church constituency of the organisation. So that happens because of our education system, where universities in Australia have no theology, apart from some church colleges which have tied up with universities. And the theological colleges run by the churches are overwhelmingly preparing people for ministry. There's nowhere in Australia where people can get that combined training in the hard skills you need to run these complex organisations, and the theological resources to be able to think about the bigger questions, the questions that need to be asked and answered to sustain these organisations in the long term. And I'm involved with a couple of discussions at the moment in trying to set up things that will have integrated people that are able to do that, to be the next generation of leaders for these organisations. ACU's done it in Victoria for Catholic educators. The Centre for Social Impact is in Western Australia more than in Sydney, is thinking along those lines. Melbourne College of Divinity is developing a new program. Maybe Crawford could do it as well. I think it would be a great contribution to public policy in Australia. Now, I think as well the government needs to think about funding the maintenance of organisational mission. And this is where people started abusing me on the ABC site.
We'd hope so.
Now, the argument here is that if painting the buildings is necessary to the long-term survival of the organisation, then the government should fund the full costs of the organisation, including paying the buildings, including remodelling the buildings, rewiring them for IT when technology changes, when the world changes. So what is wrong with the government funding the maintenance of the culture of the organisation, the sense of mission that brought it into being and will sustain it over the long term? One objection to this is that it violates the wall of separation between church and state. But the wall of separation doesn't exist in Australia, it doesn't even exist in America. That's a off-the-cuff comment by Thomas Jefferson. What our Constitution actually says is that there can be no establishment, so we can't have the Anglican Church or any other church in Australia as an established church, an officially recognised, the officially recognised Church of Australia, and there can be no religious test for public office. Neither of those two things is violated in any way by funding the maintenance of mission of a religious organisation. And I would be strongly in favour of funding maintenance of mission for Islamic and Jewish and Buddhist organisations alongside Christian organisations. The religious basis that sustains social service work in other religious traditions is just as important. The government, partly because of the failings of our education system and most public policymakers' complete ignorance of religious history and religious realities, a lot of government bureaucrats tend to think that, well, you can just separate the two, that you can have all of the nice social service stuff and all the bad sort of theology, we can get rid of that. But the problem is that, and historical examples are too numerous to go through, history shows that you cannot separate things like that. Religion is a package. The social service work only happens when it's nourished by the belief, the practices, the individual and corporate practices of churches. You're having yourself on, the government is having itself on if it thinks it can just take part of the package. The part of the package that it thinks it's taking will wither and will die. So that's what I mean by government naivety about separating doctrine and practice. And I think there's some naivety even in the organisations themselves about the capacity to separate these things. So various other proposals. I didn't make this in the ABC article, but it occurred to me since that, how about this proposal that if the organisations are trading on their Christian identity with unemployed people and with others, then surely some sort of dividend to the church is appropriate in order to maintain that which they're trading on. Now, that would go down like a lead balloon. It would go down like a lead balloon. You can tell me why in question time. But
which is coming soon.
Which is coming soon, yes. I'm going on slightly longer than I thought. But so that might be more palatable if the organisations, instead of giving it to their churches, I wouldn't give it to some of the churches anyway. I think their organisations are completely dysfunctional. But if you donated, if the organisations instead were to support some sort of training fund, development fund, centrally, then that could be written into the costs of the contract in a way which I think the government would find far more palatable to fund than funding direct contributions to churches. And we'll skip the anti-discrimination stuff. So, that's all I want to say. Basically, I have grave concerns about the future of the sector, and those concerns, I think, it's hard to see how we're going to find a way out. With regulators and some in the sector who I think are dangerously naive about the capacity to sustain these organisations in the long term without the religious connections which originally got them started. And also I think that the lack of sophistication in the sector about the incentive structure of the contracts, which means even if you get some of that other stuff right, that things can still go badly astray if you're implementing it in a self-defeating way in the actual details of the contracts and the arrangements.